Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Big Tent, where political merchants come to trade. Hosted by Circus Bazaar Magazine and produced by Circus Bazaar Productions, where truth is stranger than fiction.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. Ich bin ein Berliner.
Join the Progressive Party. We've had a problem here.
Obviously, being a woman in public life.
An iron curtain has descended across the country.
Hi there, people. Welcome to episode 2 of Circus Bazaar Magazine's The Big Tent podcast. Today we have an awesome guest to discuss the biggest of topics. Firstly though, if this is the first time you've come across us and want to know more about us, head over to circusbazaar.com and check out our politically and historically orientated magazine. And if you're interested in our commercial activities, check out circusbazaarproductions.com. I shall put both these links in the podcast description. If you're familiar with us, you know that we're a publication and company that's passionate about political debate and the biggest and most pertinent issues of the day. And as far as big questions go, there's no greater question than how does the existing structure of global power peacefully absorb and accommodate a rising China, and is the United States in relative decline? Everywhere you look, you can see this manifesting, economically, politically, and even to an extent culturally. Gone are the times in which we could legitimately argue that the rapid deindustrialization of Western countries and the opening up of their labour markets to foreign competition was a state of affairs in which governments could reasonably expect people in democratic nations to tolerate. See, in my mind, politics is the world of multiple truths and juggling multiple moralities. What passes for right and wrong domestically is very different from the chaotic and lawless world of relations between countries. For instance, when we could once say that the free movement of labour within the EU was a condition compatible with British social democracy, the very second the Brexit vote became a reality, this instantly became a political untruth. The same is true with Donald Trump, where he has capitalised simultaneously on both the sentiments of a traditional centre-left vote that has been so badly hurt by deindustrialisation, and the fury at a secular and globalist cosmopolitanism that has left more rooted people feeling as though they're merely a piece of footpath to be walked over. And while this ever more globalised world was something that the United States leveraged as it ascended to become the global superpower, we now see a situation in which the international norms and commons in which this power underpins are fast becoming a net contributor to instability, whilst a true economic competitor like China thrives under those same norms. Should we be at all surprised that given this, that the US, as the still dominant superpower, would attempt to then shift the rules of the game in its own favour? Might it be that the obvious cultural and political instability that we see across the Western world today just be in part a low-resolution view of the massive shifting of global power from west to east? These are big questions. So today's guest is none other than Christopher Layne, the Distinguished Professor of International Affairs and Robert M. Gates Chair in International Security at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. On the topic of international relations theory, great power politics, US foreign policy, and grand strategy, Chris has a long and illustrious history of being published across a massive range of influential media and policy journals. There are literally dozens of his articles and academic papers to be found across the world, from the United States to Norway and down to Australia. Some of these include Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The National Interest, The New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic Monthly, The Financial Times, The Los Angeles Times, the Norwegian Nobel Institute, and The Australian. He's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a member of the editorial boards of Security Studies and International Security. He's the author of several books, including Should America Promote Democracy?, The Peace of Illusions, American Grand Strategy from 1940 to Present, American Empire, A Debate with Bradley A. Thayer. And this much anticipated forthcoming book, in which we'll discuss today, is After the Fall, International Politics, US Grand Strategy, and the End of Pax Americana. So without further ado and any more excess flattery to our highly esteemed second guest on CB's The Big Tent podcast, I want to introduce Christopher Layne. Hi Chris, how you doing? Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and let's go.
First, Shane, thank you for asking me to be on with you. My academic background, to give you a capsule, I received my PhD from Berkeley. I studied under Kenneth Waltz, who was one of the most famous international relations scholars in the second half of the 20th century. My current specialties, and I guess they have been since I was in graduate school, are international relations theory. I'm a realist, pretty hardcore realist. And my subfields are American foreign policy and great power politics, which is why I'm interested in China. I mean, when you're talking about great power politics today, it's really the Sino-American rivalry that fits the bill.
Yeah, it really is the most pertinent geopolitical question of the day, isn't it?
Well, the big question, I suppose, right now is whether over time President Trump's trade war is going to turn into a real war and causes a great deal of turmoil, often results in war. And rising great powers usually have the same grand strategic objective. They want to be the dominant power or hegemon in their own region. Now, the problem with the U.S. and China is that since 1945, the U.S. has been the incumbent hegemon in East Asia. The Chinese don't like that. They've made it very clear that they don't like that they want to displace us. But I think the American foreign policy establishment has no interest or intent of sort of gracefully yielding to China on this issue. So I got what I call the Dodge City syndrome. I don't know how many people are still fans of American Western movies, but if you are, you all seen that movie. The two gunslingers run into each other in the saloon, and one of them says to the other, "This town ain't big enough for both of us." And we all know how that ends, and I'm afraid that you see the same kind of geopolitical dynamic between the United States and China.
Is there a genuine political debate within the United States foreign policy establishment over whether or not the US can or will actually retreat from its role as hegemon in the Asia Pacific?
I think you're asking the right question, but I think I would reframe it because, yeah, that's the question American policymakers should be asking. They should be thinking about what the risks of trying to maintain American dominance in East Asia are, and what the consequences of that policy may be in terms of Sino-American conflict. But we're not going to see that debate in the United States in all likelihood. Our foreign policy establishment, I think Bill Woolforth, who teaches at Dartmouth and is sort of my foil in this debate, but he said something in one of his recent publications, which I think is absolutely right. The American foreign policy establishment loves American hegemony, and there's no reason to think that they're going to voluntarily give it up. Who was it who said, "Rage, rage against the dying of the light"? Was it Dylan Thomas? I can't remember. But American foreign policy establishment is not likely to just fold its tent and steal off into the night, dead of night, in East Asia. I think the Americans are not prepared to accommodate China's rise, and that's dangerous.
Okay, then, well, if there is a reality upon us in which the Chinese rise is inevitable, at what point do we recognize that the US loses its hegemonic status?
I guess the answer to that is, how do you define a hegemon, or how, more specifically, how do you define the bases of American hegemony? I think American hegemony rested on the following: overwhelming military superiority, overwhelming military dominance, soft power dominance, American institutions that we created after 1945. Each of those pillars of American hegemony is eroding, some more quickly than others, but they're all in trouble. And if we can go over each one if you want.
Well, that's what we're here for. Go ahead, for sure.
Okay, well, first of all, let's start with economic hegemony. The United States ended, when World War II ended, was overwhelmingly the most powerful nation in the world, militarily and economically. The United States produced fully 50% of the world's economic output when World War II ended. That's pretty staggering. And that was one of the main pillars of American post-World War II dominance. Our share of world economic output has declined a lot, which is not unexpected. I mean, 1945, Germany and Japan were destroyed. France and Great Britain suffered greatly from the war. So our economic competitors were in bad shape. Russia was devastated. So that 50% was never going to last forever. But scholars like Joseph Nye, who's famous for developing the idea of soft power, wrote a few years ago that the, quote, natural share of world GDP for the United States was about 25%. Well, we're down to 18% now. So the economic base for American dominance is beginning to dwindle. And if we look at from an IR theory perspective, we have a theory, hegemonic stability theory, and that theory holds that a dominant power economically, the economic hegemon, has to perform certain tasks in the international system. And this was all laid out by the great economic historian Charles Kindleberger, brilliant 1973 book called The World in Depression. He looked at why the international economy broke down after 1929, and it was because Great Britain was no longer able to play the role of economic hegemon, and the U.S. wasn't willing to step up to the plate and play that role. So there was no leadership in the international economy. So what is it the economic hegemon supposed to do? Well, first, they're supposed to provide a reserve currency. The U.S. still does that. Secondly, they're supposed to make rules of the game for the international economy, because after all, as many of our scholars point out, this is supposed to be a liberal, rules-based international order. Well, who makes the rules? The economic dominant power makes the rules. The dominant economic power is supposed to provide stimulus, liquidity to the international system. The economic hegemon is supposed to be the market of last resort. When there's an economic downturn, the economic hegemon is supposed to throw open its markets and buy the products of other nations in order to kickstart their economic recovery. So on that score, this last score, I think the United States is doing pretty badly. I think if we remember the first meeting of the so-called G20, when it replaced the G8, took place in London in April of 2009. And President Obama made what I think is a very startling statement, which was not the subject of a single op-ed article in a major American newspaper. But here's what Obama said. He said, you guys in the rest of the world, you cannot look to the American consumer to continue buying your products in order to keep your economies going and pull you out of this great recession. We're broke. We can't afford to do it. We're tapped out. Our credit cards are maxed out. So this was really a historic thing for a president of the United States to say. That's just sort of, it's like the forest and trees question. The president of the United States makes a statement like this, but nobody seems to pick up on it. Does it really matter? But I think it does matter because it's factually true. And also, the economic hegemon is, when there are crises or downturns in the national economy, the economic hegemon is supposed to solve those problems, not supposed to cause them. But what caused the Great Recession in 2008? Subprime lending in the American mortgage market. So we created the crisis instead of resolving it. So in those areas, I think that you can see the bases of American economic dominance are beginning to sort of get nibbled away at the edges. I know some people will say, and this is still important and it's true, the dollar is still the reserve currency. But there are a lot of reasons to wonder, will that be true 25 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now? And of course, when I talk about this in my class, I always reach into my pocket and I pull out my wallet. And I take out my American Express Gold Card. And I said, Uncle Sam has one of these, except it's called United States of America Express Card. And unlike me, Uncle Sam never has to pay. This is one of the great things about being reserve currency. You can run up debts with your trading partners, with the people who lend you money. And of course, we're dependent on China and Japan, especially to fund our federal deficits by buying treasury bonds. As long as they do that, the United States can have all the guns and butter it wants. There's a difference between, when we used to talk about, why isn't the United States Greece, right, with our huge deficits? Because we have a printing press and we can print money and other people will take it. At the moment the United States loses that, if it loses that, our ability to be a hegemon in any sense, militarily or economically, will be severely compromised.
So in your mind, is US economic hegemony resting upon US military dominance, or is it the other way around?
That's an interesting question, Shane, and it's a question that is subject to some debate in the academic community. There are people like Stephen Brooks and William Wilforth or Karla Norloff who say that American economic dominance supports American military dominance. It's an interesting argument. You can read what they say. I'm not sure they're right. And the reason I'm not sure they're right is because the United States spends an awful lot of money on its military. And why do we do that? We do that to maintain the global commons and to keep markets open in regions that are economically important to us. So I think you can make the argument that over time, American economic hegemony is actually weakened by excessive spending on military power. But this is it is a point of debate.
And is it this paradox that the cost of upkeeping of the global commons eventually leads to the bankruptcy of the hegemonic position?
This is the classic argument that Paul Kennedy made in his great 1987 book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. But it's very interesting. During the 1980s, Kennedy was not the only one to make this argument. There were at least two other very prominent scholars, David Kaleo and Robert Gilpin, who basically made the same argument. In fact, there's a great quote from Gilpin's book, I think it's a 1986 book or 1987 book, where he talks about all the ills ailing the United States and eroding American economic dominance. Too much spending on the military, chronic federal deficits, rising national debt, too much consumption, not enough investment. I'm thinking, if you read this, it seems very contemporary in a way. I mean, it's a great diagnosis of the problems that America continues to face. Of course, skeptics can go back and say, well, yeah, but has the bottom fallen out of the United States economy since 1987 or 88? No. So were Gilpin and Kennedy really right? I think it'll take some time to tell, but I think over time, they will be proven right. I say right now we're in the process of beginning to see them proven right.
Obviously, in past decades, we've seen the US and other Western countries more generally suffer huge amounts of deindustrialization. Can you be a great military and economic power without a strong industrial base?
Another great question. Obviously, President Trump thinks not, thinks you still have to have a big steel industry to be a dominant military power. Technology changes. We've gone from an era, in the 19th century, where coal and steel were the key metrics of industrial strength. So now technology is seemingly much more important. I mean, yeah, if you're going to build tanks and airplanes and aircraft carriers, you still have to produce some steel, but you still have to be the dominant steel producer in the world. That's not clear. But you need to be a leader in whatever the key industries and technologies are in the international economy. And today, I suppose that's things like artificial intelligence, high-tech, software development. And we like to think that we're number one. We like to think that, specifically with reference to China, that China cannot innovate. This is something that has sort of become a mantra among the hegemony crowd in the American foreign policy establishment. China can't innovate. Now, anybody with a sense of history kind of has to have a raised eyebrow when they hear that. Robert Lieber at George Washington University, but he's not then Joseph Joffe, who is now at the Stanford's Hoover Institute. They've both written books fairly recently, within the last several years, where they make this argument, well, America's always going to be number one because China doesn't know how to innovate. Well, let's go back, just turn the clock back a little bit. Gunpowder, to printing press, to compass. Where did they come from? Paper. Where did they come from? They didn't come from the United States or Western Europe. Well, there was no United States. They didn't come from Europe. They came from China. And that sort of this proves right there the notion that there's something ingrained in the Chinese culture that they can't innovate. And I know some people say, yeah, but it's like baseball. What have you done for us lately? Well, let's look. They are basically neck and neck with the United States on what most people think is the most important evolving area of technology, which is artificial intelligence. They're extremely innovative. There's a story in the New York Times over the weekend. China is basically well on its way to solving its pollution problem. Who's leading in the development of electric cars? China is. So you see that, in fact, they do know how to innovate. And, it's sort of this American idea that somehow we have a God-given right to be number one in everything and that nobody can compete with us. Well, there's no historical basis for having an outlook like that.
I had the impression this idea had less to do with innovation in the long historical context and more related to the more command-type structure of communist China today and the absence of the type of freedoms we in the West hold as synonymous with innovation in the modern economy.
Well, who are we measuring that against? I mean, what are our examples? Most people would say the Soviet Union. And I guess they were only innovative when it came to missiles and tanks, but they weren't very innovative in anything else. And that's one of the reasons why they lost the Cold War. But Nazi Germany, or Wilhelmine Germany, neither of which was the kind of system that we have here in the United States, were both very innovative in science and industry. Look, there's a book by Aaron Friedberg, who teaches at Princeton. And he's kind of a China hawk. I mean, he believes that the United States really needs to stand up to China and contain them. And there's a great line in his book where he talks about it's just outrageous. It's outrageous that China, which is not a liberal democracy, should be experiencing so much economic growth and challenging the United States. Well, so what's the takeaway from that? I guess there's several. One is that the real China threat is not geopolitical. It's to America's self-perception of itself as the dominant power and the power with a better social and economic model than anybody else. And you can look at statements, speeches that both President Bush 43 and Barack Obama gave, where they said basically the same thing. Our model, the American model, is the only model for political and economic development in the modern world. Well, China has a model which has been pretty successful, and it's not that Western U.S. model. It's been called market authoritarianism, but whatever it is, it seems to work. And we hear constantly this refrain from a certain group of hardcore American policy analysts. Oh, China can never sustain this. They're going to collapse. Their economy is going to collapse. In fact, there are some people, I won't name names, but there are some people who've been predicting China's economic collapse because it is a command economy and not a democracy for over 30 years. Hasn't happened yet, and I don't think there's any reason to think it is going to happen. But it shows you sort of how American elites have a very narrow viewpoint. They just cannot accept that another country, particularly one that doesn't share our culture, our values, our political, our economic systems, could ever be a serious challenger to the United States in the international political system. And I think that's very foolish.
To be really objective, the only thing I think that we can really say now about capitalism is that it's showing to be remarkably adaptable, given that paradoxically the political environment in which it's currently thriving best under is communist administration. It's like the ultimate joke of 20th century ideological history, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, Xi Jinping is very focused on what they call the China model, or what some American academics call market authoritarianism. But call it what you want. The Chinese have a model of political and economic development which has legs and which is a saleable product in much of the world. Again, we tend to be sort of blinkered in the way we look at the world. Most of the world is not composed of North America and Western Europe. Most of the people in the world live in Asia, in the Middle East, and Africa. And those countries have been the victims of Western imperialism and capitalism as they see it. And so China comes along, a country which has also historically been a victim of the West, and says, hey, we have an idea, a way of fashioning a political and economic system that will allow rapid growth and modernization and allow us to achieve living standards comparable to the West without taking on the baggage of democracy or Western political systems. And I think in a lot of the world that has appeal. And we're seeing this. I mean, look at the Belt and Road Initiative and how many people are in, or how many countries in Africa and Central Asia and Southwest Asia and even Southeast Asia are wanting to jump on that bandwagon.
Yeah, I don't really think a lot of people realize what the world map looks like when you stretch out and examine the Central Asian landmass as a singular geographical structure. And then you look at what the Chinese are doing regarding the One Belt, One Road initiative and the potential for the geopolitical dominance of the so-called world island, the amount of money being spent, etc. It's totally phenomenal. It
is phenomenal. And, there's several issues that you raise in that very pithy summation. First, there was a classic magazine cover that the New Yorker had many years ago, where New York is sort of the dominant thing. And I look out at the United States and the rest of the world, and everything is shrunken. And New York is dominant. It's big in this picture. And the rest of the world is very minuscule. I think that's how Americans look at the world. War number one. I mean, well, I don't know if you're wearing a New York Yankees cap. I don't know if you're an American sports fan, but if you're familiar with the culture of American sports, everything is about being number one. I mean, if you go to a college football game, you won't see anybody selling war number 2 foam fingers that you can wave. It's war number 1. So we believe that we are entitled to be number 1. Secondly, you hit on something that's very important, and I think hasn't really been absorbed yet by the American foreign policy establishment. This One Belt, One Road initiative is not just economic, it's geopolitical in its intent. And you have to go back to the days at the beginning of the 20th century when the great English geopolitician, Sir Halford Mackinder, wrote his famous book, The Geographic Pivot of History, where he described his thesis that any state that could dominate the Eurasian heartland would be able to dominate the world because it would control the vast resources of Eurasia, manpower, natural resources, industrial capability. And what did he say? Who controls the world island, i.e. Eurasia, controls the world. Well, it seems like there are people in this Zhongnan High, which is the Chinese leadership compound, who seem to have read Mackinder and grasped that idea, because this is what they are trying to do, is build this network of communications links, of investments in industry and infrastructure that will make China the dominant power, not only in East Asia, but in Central Asia, Southwest Asia, Africa. And that will allow them to pose, in some respects, a challenge to American hegemony. So it's a very shrewd strategy in some ways.
Yeah, it is Mackinder's Heartland thesis that I'm referring to. Actually, many years ago when I was studying in Hong Kong, a teacher of mine and me discussed this, and he somewhat abrasively brushed the idea off as a relic of British colonial thinking. It definitely is something that's interesting that China have now adopted it as a spearhead of their geopolitical strategy, isn't it?
Yes, it does.
When I release this, I might have to tweet this guy and remind him of our conversation. I'm wondering though, what are your thoughts on this as a relevant concept in today's much more technologically advanced world?
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess my first question is whether that theory is even relevant today. What difference does it make to American security and strategic interests if China does dominate the Eurasian heartland? Now, historically, and this goes back to the early days of independent America, when you had the wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Historically, American foreign policymakers have had this great fear, which predated Mackinder, but it's basically based on Mackinder's idea, that if a single power could unite Europe, they would have all these resources and it would be able to project power across the Atlantic and threaten America at home. And actually, that's the reason why we were worried about the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars. It's the reason we were worried about and intervened against Germany in World War I. That's what we were worried about in World War II. And it's a lot of the reason why we were so intent on containing the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But the question is that idea of a great power uniting Eurasia or part of Eurasia, whether it's Europe or Asia, into a single entity and controlling all those resources really matter anymore? I mean, it's like the nuclear, people who believe that must believe that the nuclear revolution never happened. And there was a brilliant book written by Robert W. Tucker in 1975 called The New Isolationism. And Tucker was one of the first people to grasp this. If you live in a nuclear world and you have a secure second strike retaliatory capability, nobody's going to come and get you. Then the traditional balance of power, population, industry, size of the economy, doesn't really make a difference anymore in a nuclear world. So, the Chinese may want to dominate and may end up indeed dominating Eurasia, but whether that actually has any true ramifications, objectively true ramifications for American security is extremely questionable. But what's not questionable is that the American foreign policy establishment does not buy into the Robert W. Tucker argument. I mean, this is their nightmare, still their nightmare, that a single power will dominate Eurasia. But I think it's been passed by time and technology, but American policymakers still seem addicted to it.
Yeah, and the United States is right there in the Asia-Pacific, ensuring that its position remains hegemonic in nature under the pretext of ensuring the global commons you refer to.
Yes.
So I want to change topics a little bit because this is something I'm rather focused on at the moment. State power and its relationship to globalization. Because I think there's a serious gap in people's view of what globalization currently is as a construct. I see it as a phenomenon built onto the scaffolding of state power. Everything that belies it we currently call free international trade is supported by the extension of state power, right? By that I mean the protection of sea lanes, trade agreements, even sanctions, etc. But more importantly though, the shape and rules of the game are an extension of the interests of the most powerful. So what's your view on what globalization actually is?
I don't think anybody can come up with a single answer to what globalization is because it's such a handy slogan for so many things. But clearly, it means a relatively open international economy where our trade is not necessarily, there's never been pristine free trade in history, but where trade is more or less unfettered, more or less divorced from state power. And as now it's not just trade, it's financial flows, which technology enabled. So money flows freely across borders, which it did not used to do. This gets into a very sensitive issue, which I'm sure you're well aware of. Well, why does America believe in globalization or free trade? Who in America believes in that? Steel workers who got laid off in Youngstown, Ohio, don't believe in that. Coal miners in West Virginia don't believe in that. Working class Americans generally don't believe in that because they've been hurt, right? Industries have moved offshore to places where labor costs are cheaper, and America's become, as you say, deindustrialized. But who's benefiting? Well, the 1% is benefiting. And somehow that has not become a major that the idea of how American foreign policy is driven by the need, as you say, to protect the global commons so that trade and investment can flow freely. People don't realize how dominant a factor that is behind American grand strategy and who benefits from it. It may benefit certain Americans, but it's hardly clear that it benefits America.
That globalization has an apparently innate nature is really a pervasive myth, and I would even say problematic myth. We seem to be fed this narrative that a world in which capital and goods move ever freely between countries of different size with varying degrees of development and according to fleeting political interests is somehow an endgame. It's like a modern teleology, but in reality, this is all policy-based, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's policy-based, or more to the point, it's interest-based. And what do they say? Follow the money. Who has an interest in an open international economy of free trade? It's big investment firms, big banks, firms that manufacture not for Main Street, but for the global market. They want an open international economy. And what are the consequences? What are the consequences for working class Americans of that? Or we see the same thing going on in the EU. What are the consequences of globalization for the working classes in Europe? And they have the same problem of offshoring and the loss of industry, deindustrialization. So I think you have to ask, who benefits? Who gains? And I have two really good young Dutch scholars who are friends of mine, Bastian van Apeldoorn and Nana de Graaf, and they wrote a book which was just published in the last couple of years, where they actually trace the links between corporations, internationally oriented corporations, and internationally oriented banks, and how they influence the American foreign policy establishment, how there's this constant recycling of people from international firms into government, foreign policy positions in government, and back out and back in again. Now, I'm not saying that people who do that are representing specific interests of a particular corporation, but I think they do have a particular vision of how the international economy should be organized and what America's role in that is. And again, you're quite right. My graduate school colleague, Barry Posen, wrote an article where he talked about, a very influential article, about commanding the commons. And this is America's only grand strategic interest, but it's a pretty big load to bite off to do that. And the other question I guess we should ask ourselves, all right, so China's building this great wall of sand in the South China Sea. Does it really make any difference? China's a very export-driven economy. What possible interest would China have in closing down international trade and shutting the sea lanes in the South China Sea? Not in their interest. They depend on exports. It's funny, the United States does not really depend on exports. Maybe our interest in the global commons is less than China's.
So what's your view on the reasons they're doing it?
I think they're trying to force the U.S. out of East Asia as a military power. They're trying to establish their regional hegemony. But this doesn't mean they're going to cut off trade. Although with the Belt and Road Initiative, they're certainly trying to turn trade to their advantage. But that doesn't mean they're trying to shut off trade. That's very interesting. Who has now emerged as the great nation advocating an open international economy, particularly after Trump's declared intent to slap tariffs on imported steel and aluminum? So Chinese. It's like, well, not just Xi Jinping going to Davos in 2017 and presenting himself as the paragon of the rules-based liberal international order, but they're doing it right now. The response to Trump is, well, if America favors a closed economy, we favor an open economy, and we're going to stand up for that. And I think there's sort of an interesting historical parallel. What was the first country to believe in free trade? It's Great Britain. And Great Britain, why did they believe in free trade? Because they were the first mover in the Industrial Revolution. They didn't have any competition. They wanted to sell their products abroad. People wanted to buy their products. But by the 1880s and 1890s, a lot of people in the British foreign policy establishment were no longer in favor of free trade. You had Joseph Chamberlain, who wanted imperial preference and sort of an imperial trade bloc, which was ultimately sort of realized by his offspring, Neville Chamberlain, in the late 20s and 30s, when the British finally did adopt imperial preference. But I think you can make the argument that when states rise and they're first movers and they're dominant economically, of course they want free trade and open international economy. If they have something to sell and there are people who want to buy it. But once you have competitors, not only do you lose your markets abroad, you lose a lot of your domestic market, and suddenly there's a call for protection and tariffs and what have you. So I think it tells you something, even if it's only subconscious, about the relative mindsets of Chinese policymakers versus the American Foreign Policy League. I mean, the U.S. is sort of turning inward, has questions about whether it still benefits from free trade. China knows that it benefits from an open international economy. And I think that's why Xi is trying to present China as sort of the protector of that system.
So how do you reconcile the fact that you're obviously opposed to Trump, but you recognize that policy decisions across the West for decades have effectively gutted industry to a level in which large and obviously electorally important sections of our societies feel somewhat forgotten, or worse, like just walked over? Isn't a correction of the terms of trade a pragmatic response to a legitimate political grievance?
Well, I think I reconcile that by pointing out there are a number of intelligent, highly intelligent international political economists. I mentioned David Caleo a little bit earlier. He's written a lot about this. He's not the only one. Gilpin is one of the great international political economists in American academia. And there are others, too, who understand that, nobody's talking about autarky, just closing yourself completely off from the world. But the terms of trade make a difference, right? If other people can undercut you in price or quality, if they can cause the loss of significant industrial sectors in your economy and the human consequences that flow to that for workers who lose their jobs. Yeah, I mean, that's not just Donald Trump. I mean, he doesn't really understand what he's doing, I would argue. I mean, this is a debate that I have a lot with people here. It's not just on globalization. It's about what our military posture should be in the world. What would we be advocating if there were such a thing as intelligent Trumpism in foreign policy? I realize that intelligent Trumpism is an oxymoron, but
that's a really cool term.
Somebody else could come down the road and say, and look, I'm sort of associate with a circle of scholars who are known as advocates of restraint or offshore balancing, basically a much less active U.S. military role in the world, a smaller American military footprint in the world. People like Barry Posen, people like John Mearsheimer, people like Steve Wall, people like me. We haven't won this debate yet, but it's a debate now. And it was never a debate. Well, I won't say never, but you have to go back to sort of the years just before America's entry into World War II to find a time when non-interventionism was really seriously considered as an option, strategic option for the United States. So, yeah, I think there are a lot of people who can come up with intelligent arguments for scaling back America's military presence in the world. I think there are a lot of intelligent international political economists who have persuasive arguments about why we shouldn't be reflexively committed to free trade. And the truth is, is there any major economic power in the world that is committed to absolute free trade? Of course they're not. So it may be subtle, it may not be tariff barriers, but, well, who builds here? Remember what President Obama got into trouble with some free market types when he said that you didn't build it, right? Said that factory isn't just you. It's that government provided infrastructure, the government provided education, it provided scientific research and development, all of which helped you and your business build this factory and make a profit. And so, yeah, look at those things. They're indirect subsidies, building of infrastructure. All of that is a way of promoting your own domestic economy without actually closing the door to other nations' goods and services. But it does show that free trade isn't truly unfettered and free.
So then how do you view the United States allies, or as I've heard you call them before, free-riding security dependents?
Yeah, I'm embarrassed now. Give you a little bit of background. My good friend, Robert Art, who teaches at Brandeis, is sort of what we call him the field manager in security studies. And he runs this listserv that links all the major security studies scholars in the States and even some in Europe. And Bob directs this program that the MIT Security Studies program puts on every year called Seminar 21. And so there are about 6 of these events a year, and I'm always in the last one that meets in the spring. And so I give my PowerPoint briefing. And yeah, and this is also what I tell my students in class. One of my students says, well, what about our allies? I said, what? What did you say? I said, in this class, don't ever use the word allies. Call them what they are, free-riding security dependents. I always get a big laugh. I don't think I'm going to be using that line for a while now because Trump has sort of discredited it.
How do you feel about his policies then?
Well, first of all, what are his policies? What he says 1 minute is not necessarily what he says 10 minutes later. He criticized America's commitment to the Atlantic Alliance, to NATO. What's he done about it? Nothing. He suggested during the campaign that it's really South Korea and Japan should get their own nuclear weapons and worry about North Korea and China, not us. Well, he doesn't believe that anymore, apparently. So I'm not really sure what his policies are because, to be honest, I don't know, I'll get myself into trouble for saying this, but not with the people that I hang out with, because I'm sure they'll agree. This guy is colossally ignorant about the world, about history, about international politics, about the ideas that are the focus of debate historically with respect to American foreign policy. And yet he's absolutely dead sure that he's right about everything that he does. The combination of ignorance and arrogance is not one that bodes well for American foreign policy or economic policy.
Okay, so on to another topic. Am I correct in saying that you share the view with John Mersheimer that we really badly bungled the peace with respect to Ukraine?
Absolutely. And he's not we're not the only ones. Raj Menon, who teaches at City University of New York, has also written a lot about this. Look, realists are not interested in ideological crusades. We're not Don Quixotes charging around the world, tilting at ideological windmills. We're not big on promoting democracy. If states want to be democracies, they'll be democracies. But they're not going to be democracies because we force it on them. That our values, despite what every American president says, our values are, quote, universal. They're not universal. Why is it we have to fight so many wars to get other people to accept our political system and our values if they're universal? They're not. So as realists, we sort of believe in spheres of influence. So you stay out of regions where you really don't have any strategic or security interest. The United States has no strategic or security interest in Ukraine or Eastern Europe. This is all about American ideology. It's all about replicating our political and economic system. And I think that's a mistake. I think we don't want to get into a conflict with Russia over this. I think American policy towards Russia is extremely misguided, because if you really believe that the United States and China are going to be the great geopolitical adversaries of the 21st century, why would you push Russia into China's arm? You should be trying to attract them into our arms. But we don't do that. Putin is a bad guy, and basically today's Russia is just a leftover vestige of the Soviet Union. They don't have real democracy. They don't share our values. They don't have a real market economy.
But why is the big question in my mind?
It's a great question. And, what I'm waiting for, and unfortunately I probably won't be around to see this, I'm waiting for the American archives to open that pertain to, let's say, the Maidan era. Yeah, I'd bet a pretty good deal of money, if I had it, that when the American archives open them for this period, we'll find out that the CIA was up to its neck in trying to foment unrest in Ukraine. So what? We want to extend our system of political system, economic system, and our values, because we believe that a world organized on that basis will be a world in which America is secure. I don't think that's true. I don't think that has anything to do with American security. I think, in fact, ongoing quest to reshape the world along those lines leads the United States into a lot of military conflicts that it could and should avoid. But we want to extend our ideological and economic sphere of influence because we think that's the key to our security. But, go back to the end of World War II. There were two contrasting theories or policies. How do we deal with the Soviet Union when World War II ends? Well, the one that won was universalism. It was, we can't let the nations of Eastern Europe become communist because we believe in democracy, and if they become communist, that'll be bad for us. The other was, you know what? It doesn't really make any difference. As long as we can contain the Soviets and keep them in their half of Europe, political and economic systems in the Soviet sphere are not an important factor in American strategy. So let them have their sphere of influence. Don't meddle in their sphere of influence. And I know a lot of people will say, that's realpolitik, that's cynical. Henry Kissinger was pretty much accused of that when he was Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, because he sort of favored that kind of policy with the Soviets, of each of us recognizing the other sphere of influence. And that is not a popular position to take in the American foreign policy debate. But I think it's the right position to take if you want to stay out of unnecessary foreign wars.
So do you think then that the EU and Germany are somewhat an afterthought in this whole thing?
I think this is primarily driven by the United States. I mean, I'm sure that the European Union wanted to draw Ukraine away from Russia. But I don't think they were as activist in pursuing that goal as the United States was. Activists pursuing it by covert policies, covert measures.
In saying that, is the European Union capable of being a center of global power?
Please don't make me laugh. The European Union is a center of global power. Just in the last week or so, there have been a number of stories about, European defense posture. What posture? I mean, France and Britain spend money on defense, but Germany spends hardly anything on defense. And the coalition agreement, if I remember correctly, between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, it had something like 175 agenda items that the coalition is committed to accomplishing, and strengthening NATO's military capabilities and German military capabilities was about 155th on the list, which sort of tells you how much they care about investing in their security. 2 years ago, I went with a colleague of mine and some of our students on a study abroad trip to Berlin. And we were lucky to be given a briefing in the defense ministry by the German general who was responsible for the defense budget and expanding it. And we're going to add 3,000 more troops in the next 20 years. we're going to build another 50 tanks in the next 20 years. And he was trying to make this seem like this was a massive defense buildup. I mean, the Europeans just aren't, by and large, are not serious about defending themselves. And the British are different. The French are different. But where do the French commit their troops? You know, their troops aren't sitting there in Poland or the Baltic states guarding against a Russian bear. They're off chasing down Muslim militants in the Sahara. You just don't see or get the impression that the EU is really committed to taking on responsibility for its defense. And why should it be? So great book, one of the great articles, actually, by Mansur Olson and Richard Zeckhauser, called An Economic Theory of Alliances, and explains very pithily, very accessibly, why it makes sense to be a free rider. If somebody will provide a public good and allow you to consume it without paying for it, why shouldn't you consume it? And as long as the United States thinks that Europe's defense is more important to us than it is to them, why should the Europeans ever do anything more than spending the bare minimum they have to spend to keep people like Trump silent, or to keep isolationists in America at bay, prevent Americans from questioning the wisdom of their commitment to Europe? So it's not like they're free riders, but they're heavily subsidized riders. And we allow them to do that because we think it's in our interest. I'm not sure that's true, but as long as we believe it's true, they are acting rationally.
Obviously, you know, I originate in Australia.
Yes, I do.
And of course, you're aware of how Australia holds a potentially contradictory position on this issue, as it's pursuing a hugely economically important trade relationship with China, but yet it remains yoked to a security relationship with the US. So how do you see this playing out?
It's not just Australia. It's all of Southeast Asia. It goes in two different directions. That's a great field test of IR theory. When it comes to how states align, what's more important, military security or economic security in terms of trade and investment? I don't have to tell you, Australia is quite dependent on trade with China, but they're not the only ones. I mean, this is a very interesting statistic. ASEAN trade in terms of total ASEAN imports and exports. In 1993, the United States accounted for 18.9% of ASEAN's trade, total imports and exports. China accounted for 2%. I mean, 1993, that's not yesterday, but it's not that long ago either. Today, China accounts for 14%. This is as of 2013. And the U.S. share has dropped to 8.2%. So China's economy has enormous magnetic pull. And the question is, can it pull these states out of their security alignment with the United States? Well, we're already seeing in Malaysia and the Philippines, not just an economic tilt towards China, but a security tilt towards China. I follow the debate in Australia. I'm a big fan of Hugh White's. And I think he understands that, first, it's not really clear that Australia or any of the countries in Southeast Asia can really count on the United States to go to the mat for them in the case there is a serious crisis with China that poses the risk of military conflict. So, I think that these countries are right to worry about that. And I think they're also forced into a very difficult choice. I mean, the United States can't take up the slack. The United States isn't going to sell them more or import more from them. So where are they going to sell what they make? Where are they going to sell their natural resources? They need China. And if they don't have China, they're going to feel the pinch in their economic pocketbooks. And increasingly, China is going to become so dominant economically in that region that these states, all of which want to balance against China. They want the U.S. to balance militarily against China, act as a counterweight to China, but they still want to be deeply connected economically with China. But at some point, they're not going to have that choice. At some point, it's going to be one or the other, and it's really going to be a fait accompli.
Recently, where I come from in Adelaide, South Australia, there was a regional election that pitted the incumbent left-wing party that had been in power 16 years against the Conservative Party. But the thing is that during that 16 years, they'd been in power, and despite a lot of funneling of money into more high-tech sectors and cultural arts, they'd presided over a closure of 2 really large car manufacturers, and consequentially, a huge amount of blue-collar jobs. And I guess related to this is also just a massive increase in general debt burden, and at the same time, more and more cheaper foreign purchase consumerism. The Conservative Party won in more or less the same circumstances as you see happening all over the Western world. And the political hostility towards those that have moved the state out of the current course was just astonishing. I mean, we're really seeing a form of globalization that has become in practice extremely toxic to the internal politics of the Western countries. And it's not just the far right that's become more prominent. That those that have been, in this case, big supporters of the status quo have in some cases completely unshackled themselves from the political reality of these issues. I mean, hyperliberalism has become, in my mind, every bit as disturbing and anti-democratic as anything you'll find on the far right.
I basically agree with you. I think that the rise of populist political movements in the United States and in Europe and Australia, it is pushback for what globalization has done. It's what the consequences of deindustrialization are to working classes. But again, the outcome is this enormous polarization between the elites and the rest of society. I mean, if you can afford to buy the things that China is making and exporting that are good, are the things that for Americans that the Europeans make, like BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes, which Donald Trump has indicated he wants to impose a tariff on the import of European automobiles. Well, you know, if you have a lot of money, you're probably not in favor of that because you're not hurt by it. You're not an auto worker in Detroit who's out of a job. You're somebody who's well off in America and you want to have a luxury car. Could be a Mercedes or a BMW or a Lexus, whatever. So the costs and benefits of globalization are very unevenly distributed, and they contribute, I think, greatly to polarization of politics in the United States and Western Europe. And from what you're telling me, I would guess in Australia as well.
Yeah, like I said, this is not some benign and innate consequence or like a natural phenomena. I mean, China, for example, has actively leveraged its demographic strength to engage geopolitically and where it weaponizes its price point. Like you said, they're now beneficiaries of the status quo, champions of what we'd like to call the free market.
The so-called China price. Yeah, I mean, exactly what you said, that China had this vast labor force, so they could produce manufactured goods much more cheaply than the U.S. or Western Europe, which have to pay higher wages, social benefits, all of this. But, you know, I think we need to understand that China's economy is changing too. I mean, they are moving up the value ladder in terms of what they do. It's not all just cheap toys anymore, or shoes or clothes. They are producing sophisticated products now. They are catching up with the United States and the West in a lot of technological sectors. And in fact, a lot of the manufacturing that allowed China to experience this great economic growth back in the 80s and 90s, or to launch the wave of economic growth, that's moved offshore from China. So China had to move into other higher value areas economically. But they've been able to do that.
Okay, so now to be ultra dispassionate and pragmatic. Do you believe that globalization in its current form, and given the changing distribution of power globally, that it remains a tenet of political stability? Or is it en masse driving us towards a world more likely to engage in more historically normal great power conflicts of that we've seen in the past?
Well, you know, the conventional wisdom among liberal theorists of international politics has always been that free trade prevents wars. It prevents conflict because countries become interdependent, and if war occurs between them, they're all going to suffer. Now, I don't think there's a lot of actual empirical support for that, but a lot of people still believe that this is the case. I think states compete, and economics is a big factor when it comes to talking about what they compete about, because at the end of the day, Paul Kennedy was right when he wrote The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. A strong economy is indispensable if you want to be a great power in the international system. So I think we're looking at a more conflictive period in international politics ahead of us, primarily because the Sino-American relationship does have an enormous component, not only of geopolitical rivalry, but of economic rivalry. And actually, I'm not sure you can really parse those out so that they're separate from each other. I mean, why is Trump, and why do people like Peter Navarro, Death by China, his book, but why do these people worry about the Chinese economy? Why do they worry about China's growth rate, about what it's producing, about what it's innovating? Because ultimately, they're not just afraid of losing markets or having to compete harder to keep markets. They're worried about this lubricating China's rise as a great power militarily and posing a challenge to what American policy elites still conceive of as our interests. I think that's where the problem is. And this is dangerous, by the way. Paul Kennedy wrote another great book, maybe an even greater book than The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. It was The Rise of the Anglo-German Antagonism from 1890 to 1914. And one of the things that really poisoned the Anglo-German relationship was this belief among British elites that Germany wasn't playing by the rules economically, that it was engaging in subsidies or stealing British idea. I mean, same arguments that you hear today in American politics: theft of intellectual property, subsidies, tariffs, all kinds of ways to prevent British products from being sold in Germany. And no, that wasn't why Germany and Britain went to war in 1914, but that discourse helped poison the perceptions that British policymakers had of Germany. So it created a perception spiral, as I call it. And I think we see a lot of that happening today with the US and China. And I'm not sure it's objectively true. Pretty sure it's not. But we believe, a lot of our policymakers believe that it's true, and they act on it. And so what happens? The perception that American policymakers hold becomes more and more hostile.
Did you see the front cover of Time magazine later last year? I think it was the first to be printed in 2 languages by Ian Bremmer. It was called China One.
I haven't seen that. I don't get Time magazine. I get The Economist. But I think I'll have to go look for that. But I think if that's in fact what Bremmer said, I think basically he's right. Although I wouldn't say China is won. I would say China is winning, and that they're going to win. But they haven't displaced the United States quite yet as the dominant power in the world. They're rising, we're declining. But we're still ahead of them in some ways. But the margin of superiority is less and less.
Yeah, this article was a relatively shallow look at some of the reasons why the Chinese model was apparently better positioned to succeed into the future than the United States. And it was followed by a small discussion on their so-called social credit system, which I'm sure you're aware of and I kind of think is entirely terrifying. Do you believe that China represents a significant ideological threat to the United States and the Western world more generally?
You're right. The American foreign policy establishment does tend to make these black and white differentiations. Either you're a free market democracy or you're not. And if you're not, you're authoritarian, you have a statist, mercantilist economy, things that historically American elites haven't liked. But here's my response to Bremmer. He's absolutely right. We all know that China's using technology, artificial intelligence, big data to keep tabs on its people, to make sure that the Communist Party stays in power. But first of all, why is that our business? And secondly, it tends to overlook, there actually is public opinion in China. There's been some work done on this by American scholars. Chinese public is extremely nationalistic. They're behind their government. They're behind their nation. So I'm not sure what it is we're looking for. I think the ideology comes in, I think I talked about earlier. It's an Aaron Friedberg view of the world. How dare this non-democratic, non-free market economy challenge us politically, challenge us economically. They have no right to do that because they're not like us. That's the kind of arrogance that is going to get the United States into a lot of trouble.
Do you find yourself at odds with large parts of the United States foreign policy establishment with your views?
The short answer to that question is yes. I mean, look, there are, as I said, a small number of us who have been very critical. A lot of it started with the Iraq War. It didn't just start with the Iraq War. There are people like Earl Ravenel and Ted Galen Carpenter, and even me, who were highly critical of the American liberal internationalist and military interventionist foreign policy, even back in the 50s and 60s. And before them, there were other people who articulated this kind of desire for a more restrained U.S. foreign policy. But clearly now, those of us who believe in restraint or offshore balancing, whatever you want to call it, yeah, we're under attack. The foreign policy establishment doesn't like our prescription.
History shows us that all empires that rise eventually fall, but within the context that we're having this discussion, is US decline inevitable?
Well, this is sort of the third rail of American politics besides Social Security. Well, you may have heard of John Huntsman. John Huntsman was Republican governor of Utah, and he resigned because President Obama appointed him as the United States ambassador to China. And after serving there for 3 years, he resigned and came back and ran for the Republican presidential nomination in 2012, and immediately sank without a trace, except he did leave one trace. He uttered the single most perceptive comment about American decline that I've ever heard, and it really summarizes the way American elites view this issue. Don't fall out of your chair. Huntsman said, quote, "Decline is un-American." By the way, Romney came back after that and said that he was opposed to decline in all its forms. So no, it's like, if you go back to when Paul Kennedy published his book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, it's one of these books that catches the zeitgeist just the right moment. I mean, how many books of serious history ever rise to number one on the New York Times bestseller list? Big, thick book, right? If I threw that book at you, if I threw Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of Great Powers at you, I could be arrested for assault with a deadly weapon. It's a big, thick book. It's not the kind of book that non-specialists are likely to read. But this book had a great impact. Now, people weren't worried about China in the late 1980s, mid to late 1980s. They were worried about Japan. Japan is number one. Japan is eating our lunch economically. But Kennedy's argument was, I think, not just about Japan. I mean, he understood that China was going to be a big factor. But his argument was that nobody ever stays on top forever. No country ever remains hegemonic, dominant, number one forever. And this is why the reaction of the American foreign policy establishment to Kennedy's book was so hostile. Not the best in terms of its intellectual quality, but I guess in terms of showing how Kennedy's arguments were received, the best comments were made by Joseph Nye, who's a very highly regarded, well-known scholar of international relations and American foreign policy at Harvard, who served several times in high government positions in the Defense Department and CIA. He wrote a review of Kennedy's book, and he said, "This is declinism." Now, just think about that for a moment. What happens in the English language when you take a noun and put ISM at the end of it, right? It's always negative. Racism, fascism, declinism, and it was meant to be. I mean, Nye didn't do that by accident. And even now in the debate about America's grand strategic options and its foreign policy, there is a polarization between those who believe in American primacy and those who are derogatorily, sneeringly described as declinists. So, yeah, this is a sensitive nerve for American elites. The idea that somehow we're not exceptional. We believe in American exceptionalism, but maybe we're not as exceptional as we think. But nobody wants to really grasp that possibility.
The first podcast that we did was entitled Networks versus Hierarchies. It's fashionable at the moment with the advent of the internet, social media, and all things digital and crypto to believe that traditional notions of political hierarchy are being eroded in favor of networks. What's your view on this?
Well, I think in international politics, hierarchies are not being eroded. There's still a difference between great powers and the rest. International politics isn't becoming democratized by technology. And international politics is sort of a very strange blend of two things that may sound oxymoronic. It's anarchic in the sense that there is no central authority to make and enforce rules on states. But it's also hierarchic in the sense that the bigger powers, the great powers, tend to have a disproportionate influence on international outcomes. So, I remember when I was a research fellow at Harvard, this was back in the mid-90s, that we had a couple of seminars and people were saying, the development of the internet. Everything's going to become democratized now. Everything's going to change now. The masses of people, or at least the masses of the elite, are going to have direct access. There's going to be no filtering of political views, no gatekeepers. That's the beauty of the internet. Well, you know what? Political hierarchies still operate within states. The world hasn't been, despite Thomas Friedman, the world isn't flat. Thomas Friedman's head might be flat, but the world isn't flat. And these sort of techno-optimists who thought that everything was going to change, I don't think they've been proven right. Hierarchies exist within states. Hierarchy exists in the international system.
Yeah, I tend to have the same view, actually.
Well, look, there are all kinds of networks, but the idea that networks of internet-linked individuals are somehow going to displace the state. I mean, these techno-enthusiasts have been preaching this stuff for a long time, right? Sort of like Marx, the internet will cause the state to wither away because people won't need the state. They can form networks. They can communicate directly with each other. We won't need, formal political systems because people can do this on a one-on-one basis. Pardon my saying so. I think that's rubbish. And there's nothing that's happened since the advent of the internet that would really give you pause to believe that those arguments had any credence. So we still live in the same world, same, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short world when it comes to international politics that we've always lived.
The relationship between science, technology, and politics is something I find endlessly fascinating, probably because it's one of those areas in which there seems to be a constant supply of people ready to take it on as a faith that human nature can be changed by it. Although science shapes our view of the world, how we use it, I think, is definitely downstream and subject to all the basic follies of human nature.
Well, I tend to agree with you. And I'm not really an expert on the relationship between technology and politics by any stretch of the imagination. But it does seem to me that even today from Silicon Valley, we see all these pronouncements about how technology is going to change everything. Social relations, transform political affairs. Hasn't happened. I mean, they've been saying this, since the late 80s, early 90s at least. And it's kind of like that illustration I gave back at the beginning of this conversation of certain, quote, experts, unquote, who've been predicting like clockwork since the early 1990s that China is going to collapse and go away and we'll never have to worry about them. I guess we should always be skeptical of arguments that say, oh, this is going to change everything. Look how much technology we've had, how much technological development we've had. But go back and read Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian Wars. And my mentor when I was in graduate school, Ken Waltz, would bounce into our graduate seminar in international relations theory, he'd pound his fist on the desk and he'd have a big smile on his face. And he would say, quote, "That's Thucydides knew it all." And anybody who reads Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian Wars will see not how different international politics is today from what it was during the Peloponnesian Wars, but how similar it is. And despite all the technological changes that have happened between, now and then. So I guess I'm a techno-skeptic.
Well, Chris, I'd like to thank you very much for coming on our show. It's been a real honour, and what I'm thinking is that somewhere down the track, we might be able to do this again. Well,
I enjoyed this very much. I'm very grateful to you for asking me to do this, and I hope we do get a chance to do this many more times in the future, because I don't think we're going to run out of interesting things to say about international politics or American foreign policy or China. Or Europe.
And next time I'm in the United States, I'll have to come and pay you a visit, and vice versa if you're heading over to Europe or even Australia anytime soon.
Sounds like a deal. Thank you so much.